Hello everyone, this is Bob Nisbet, and this is my slightly revised version of my presentation about Edmund Sawyer that I gave at the 2025 Montana History Conference. Edmund was an American bird artist during the 20th century. Edmund was born March 1, 1880, to Joseph Sawyer and Catherine D. in Detroit, Michigan. Catherine died in Edmund's childbirth. His father, Joseph, served on the Great Lakes Life-Saving Service. He died when his boat was overturned in a storm 7 months after the birth of Edmund, leaving Edmund without parents as a baby. Edmund was given to Joseph's sister Mary to be raised in Ogdensburg, New York. Sawyer remembered being only 3 years old when he found a song sparrow nest in front of his home, and could recall the exact coloring of the eggs and the distance of the nest from the ground. He started sketching at the age of 4, and at his elementary school, an art teacher encouraged his art skills with watercolors and modeling with clay. He loved the spring and birds. I could not endure that stark, scowling, forbidding schoolroom so much that at times he would skip school and forged a note from his Aunt Mary to explain why he missed class. When he was 20, he was living with his brother in Chicago, and he attended 2 art schools there. There is no record of him getting a degree in art or any formal studies in ornithology. Edmund was fascinated with the passenger pigeon, an East Coast bird, his whole life. At one time, they numbered an estimated 3 to 5 billion birds, with the last birds going extinct around 1900 due to loss of habitat, hunting, and commercial exploitation of pigeon meat. Sawyer called their extinction the most spectacular tragedy in ornithological history. Sawyer was chosen by William Hornaday to illustrate birds for his 1904 book, The American Natural History and Encyclopedia of Wildlife. This book would be printed in 16 editions over the next 30 years, and Sawyer contributed 77 bird drawings. Sawyer also worked with ornithologist Frank Chapman, who was an author of bird books and the editor of Bird Lore magazine, which was later taken over by the Audubon Society. Sawyer provided illustrations, articles, poems, and the one illustration on the right is from The Proper Size of a Birdhouse, a bluebird cavity nester. Chapman and Sawyer collaborated on a number of books and produced a few Audubon pocket bird collections. In 1916, Sawyer published his own book, Land Birds of Northern New York, where he wrote and illustrated the book. Sawyer married Ellen May Town in 1906, and they produced 3 children, Joseph, Lawrence, and Melva Hope. Melva would later just go by Hope. Edmund struggled to be a provider with his painting career. At one point, he was an inspector at an air brake company. So he was torn between his passion of being a bird artist and naturalist and providing for his family. Ultimately, he chose his passion as an artist, and the couple broke up. In 1917, Ellen May left Edmund. Sawyer would join the Roosevelt Wildlife Association of the New York State College of Forestry, Syracuse, run by Alvin Whitney, who ran a boys' camp in Yellowstone National Park. At the camp, there was a staff of naturalists and artists, and Sawyer spent the summers of 1922 and 1923 there. At the end of 1922, Sawyer and Whitney stayed an extra week, and while sketching and photographing bears, one bear left a few scratches on his camera. In 1923, President Harding visited Yellowstone for 2 days. Yellowstone Superintendent Horace Albright knew of Sawyer and had him make decorative dining table cards for a breakfast luncheon. 15 of these mini watercolor artworks still exist in the collection of Albright's granddaughter. While lecturing to a group of hikers, an official appreciated his interpretive skills, leading to his position as Yellowstone Park Naturalist beginning in 1924. This is the best picture of Edmund during his time in Yellowstone National Park on the left, and the Park Museum on the right. Sawyer arrived in the park in January 1924 and immediately wrote a couple of poems, Winter in Yellowstone Park and Upper Deer Creek Cabin. From the first poem about winter in Yellowstone Park, he wrote, "Now the tourist south has flown, or to a distant sea, and left the snowbound Yellowstone to winter and me." And about the cabin, he wrote, "From Blacktail Creek hard by I dip the water for my tea. My bacon sizzles in the pan. This is the life for me." So he loved the isolation and ability to get away from the crowds in the winter in Yellowstone. Besides museum duties, Sawyer produced a monthly edition of a bulletin, Yellowstone Nature Notes. There were other parks that also created monthly bulletins about nature happenings in their parks. And Sawyer started his edition in June 1924. He added cover art and inside drawings, and he included contributions from others, such as Marguerite Lindsay and Ranger Charles Phillips. The Nature Notes bulletins were all black and white. However, toward the end of Sawyer's 4 years in Yellowstone, the administration asked him to colorize a set of the bulletins for the park, and there's an example on the right of a colorized golden eagle, and here you have a colorized lazuli bunting. Here are several bird illustrations he made at the museum, and he liked to compare and contrast birds from the West Coast and the East Coast. Here you have the Western tanager on the left and the East Coast scarlet tanager. Here is a mountain bluebird on the left. And Sawyer also got interested in drawing mammals during his time in Yellowstone. Here's a mountain lion, and he definitely started drawing mammals at this time, although he was predominantly a bird artist. Here are two larger bison herd paintings that he left behind at Yellowstone Park in the Yellowstone collection. Sawyer grew to like coyotes during his time in Yellowstone, even though early on during his time there he helped with the trapping of the species. There was one coyote that was pulled from its den by someone, raised in captivity, and brought to Sawyer. It was dog-like, could be petted, it wagged its tail, and there were actually two coyotes brought where he kept in the park, at least for some brief period of time. One was named Jip, and he would take Jip to the museum and hotel, and it was always the center of attention for photos and petting. Perhaps because of his fondness for these pet coyotes, but also because of his unique observation skills. Sawyer wrote a several-page memo to Albright in 1927 discouraging the hunting of coyotes in the park. Wolves had already been eliminated in the park. Mountain lions were hunted in winter and were largely gone by the mid-1920s. And in this memo, Sawyer wrote to Superintendent Albright to reduce coyote predator control, which was generally justified as coyotes were thought to be destructive to young antelopes, now called pronghorn. But Sawyer had not observed them taking large mammals, but that they had stalked and caught mice in abundance. So he was an early voice to reduce predator control in the parks, but other biologists in the 1930s actually changed National Park Service policy. This is a Sawyer painting of coyotes, ravens, and magpies scavenging on a carcass in the park, titled Christmas Dinner in Yellowstone. In the lower right-hand corner it says, "From Life, 1927. Sawyer made a unique drawing, some have called a cartoon, related to the Albright family returning to the park in October 1925. They were returning from a superintendent's conference in Mesa Verde on October 23, 1925, when a sudden violent snowstorm hit Yellowstone National Park. Their car, loaded with suitcases, adults, and children, got stuck coming over Sylvan Pass, the east entrance to the park, and this illustration shows the Corkscrew Bridge right below Sylvan Pass. Rangers rushed horses and other equipment to the rescue, and after some effort, they managed to drag the car safely over the pass and onto cleared roads. Sawyer thought the whole scene was amusing and worthy of poking fun at the chief. President Coolidge, his wife Grace, and son John visited the park over 5 days in August 1927. Sawyer was one of a few park officials to accompany the group. Here is the Coolidge entourage at the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, looking at ospreys, with the president on the left, then Superintendent Albright, his Coolidge's son John, an unknown man, and Sawyer is pointing to the right. The president and his wife Grace took a fishing trip on Yellowstone Lake during their visit. Sawyer saw the president glance toward a singing mountain chickadee. Sawyer commented, "I wondered if the president quite realized that he is a nature lover. I had never heard. It occurred to me that everyone is a nature lover, only some are more conscious than others of the fact." Mrs. Coolidge also had a fine time catching fish on the lake. Here are a couple of photos of Sawyer feeding black bears with the presidential entourage. You can identify John Coolidge in the center with his hat in the center window. Besides feeding black bears with the presidential party, Sawyer was picked to guide the president and his family to the canyon bear feeding grounds where hotel food scraps were fed to the bears. Afterwards, Sawyer wrote, "It was my privilege as the park naturalist to add directly to the entertainment of the President and Mrs. Coolidge by explaining the mammal and bird life, particularly at the canyon. There I spent an hour with Mrs. Coolidge watching and discussing the grizzly and black bears, gulls, ravens, brewer blackbirds, and pipits on the bears' feeding ground. For this pleasant service upon our return, Mrs. Coolidge thanked me very warmly and expressed her pleasure in the trip to the feeding ground." A side story of the presidential visit to the park was Sawyer met Helen Bottom, who would become his third wife in 1936. This is a picture of Helen probably from the 1940s. But before that, he would marry his second wife in late 1927, Catherine McKay, and they were married for a few years but struggled and ended in divorce. But Helen, when he married his third wife in 1936, they would be together for the rest of their lives. Natural history museums usually displayed life-sized models of animals, but because of limited museum space in Yellowstone, mammal models at 1/8 life-size scale were made, and Sawyer was in charge of constructing these models. The model groups included buffalo, bear, mountain sheep, elk, and moose, and the completed moose group became the museum's most popular exhibit. Sawyer resigned on April 1st, 1928, and wrote memos to Albright with his reasons why, but these memos have not been found. He did state he didn't want to be a naturalist again. We can speculate why he resigned. He had a son, Joseph, his oldest son, had come out and finished high school in Livingston near the park. He was newly married to his second wife. He maybe didn't like all the crowds at the museum. He'd rather be a field guy in a blind studying birds. We just don't know. But for personal reasons or professional reasons, he moved on. He became the New York State field ornithologist for a couple of years, serving in Albany, New York. And what his duties there are not exactly known. He provided drawings for the Bulletin of the Schools, a publication of the New York State University, and this included a Bird Day edition every year. You've got a meadowlark from 1930 and a cover of the Bird Day edition from 1931. Sawyer wrote and illustrated poems of nature and wildlife in 1930. 1,500 copies were printed, each book signed and numbered. The book included Yellowstone National Park poems and other poems about birds which had appeared in various publications. The Cranbrook Institute would publish a series of books about how to create birdhouses starting in 1931, with the first title being Birdhouses, How to Make Them and Where to Place Them. Sawyer felt birdhouses were needed as mankind destroyed natural nesting sites in trees with hollow trunks, and because introduced house sparrows and European starlings claimed available nesting cavities. At some point, probably in 1933 or shortly after, Sawyer moved to his son's property in the Centennial Mountains west of Yellowstone National Park. His son had homesteaded 80 acres below the Continental Divide in 1933, and Edmund built a cabin on the property. Edmund wrote that he spent a long and dreary winter there and that he needed at least bird company. Post offices built in the 1930s during President Roosevelt's New Deal were decorated with images of the American scene. Sawyer sent in animal sketches for a Billings, Montana post office mural but was not selected. He submitted a passenger pigeon design for a mural competition which was displayed in a museum in Washington, D.C. President Roosevelt came to view the exhibit and thought his design was outstanding for its trueness to nature and the exquisite beauty of its creation. He received a commission for a passenger pigeon mural in Denison, Ohio, in the post office there. Sawyer knew that this location was on the migratory path of the passenger pigeon. His oil-on-canvas mural was installed in 1940, and Sawyer considered it to be his best work. Several times in the 1930s and 1940s, Sawyer checked himself into a sanitarium or state hospital for treatment, most likely for depression. It's possible the strain of making a modest living through various sources without a steady job contributed to his depression. Early American bird artist Alexander Wilson, father of American ornithology, worked himself to death living in chronic poverty. James John Audubon went bankrupt and was thrown in jail for debt and was beset by black depressions. So all three men struggled in their career as bird artists. Edmund and his wife Helen went on a grand adventure during World War II when they volunteered to be part of the Aircraft Warning Service. They were ground observers at the Copper Mountain Lookout at 6,280 feet in what is now the North Cascades National Park, a few miles south of the Canadian border in Washington state. Edmund was 62 and Helen was 50 years old. To get to the lookout, it involved going over 10 miles of difficult trail from the Glacier Ranger Station, and pack trains would carry their supplies up to the lookout, which was 14 feet square with a separate storehouse and outhouse. No oil or food could reach the lookout between late October and the following late spring, and Mrs. Sawyer planned groceries for a balanced diet for 7 to 9 months. Additional pack trains brought 600 gallons of fuel oil and kerosene. The last supply train arrived around November 1 in one of the worst storms of the season, with large trees snapping like matchsticks where the supply train stayed the night on the trail. In the lookout, Edmund and Helen sat all night fully dressed, flashlights and emergency rations in pockets, listening to the building's timbers, boards, and cables creak and moan, and watching its sides sway and heave, while outside the roar of the storm was deafening. They were all set to make a dash for the door as soon as the building should start to move down the mountain. Over the winter, snow piled up 6 to 14 feet deep around the lookout, and they dug a tunnel as their only exit, and which was a daily effort to keep the tunnel clear of snow. They heard avalanches every day, and a black bear raided their storehouse, leaving with bacon and butter. Edmund loaded a shotgun with blanks, shot the bear, which would never return. The Sawyers were required to transmit reports every 2 hours, day and night, and their transmission was always nothing to report. So Sawyer would turn to his art and nature study during his other time there. And here are a couple of his sketch drawings from Copper Mountain on September 6 and 10 of a kestrel and a pigeon hawk. And now we call those merlins. The Sawyers would move to Bellingham, Washington, and one thing that Sawyer did there is he wrote books, including Game Birds and Others of the Northwest, which he wrote and illustrated. On the right are print blocks, kind of rubberized print blocks, which he used to illustrate the books. And here you can see a page of the illustrations on the left and a mirror image. You have to flip it over so that this bird here, number 1 on the left, is in the upper right on the print block. Sawyer wrote a Sunday column for the Seattle Times, Pacific Northwest Nature Notes, from 1949 to 1952, which included over 100 articles. These articles were about birds, mammals, wildflowers, ferns, butterflies, mushrooms, and fish. He also wrote for a number of sportsmen's magazines. Here's a cover and the table of contents from American Woodsman, 1953, and you can see the illustration here on the outside of the table of contents of August 1953. In 1956, Helen and Edmund moved to Vashon Island, a small island about 20 miles southwest of Seattle. It would be their home for the rest of their lives. He immediately became a distinguished artist on the island and over time became known as the Birdman. A reporter visited his home at age 79 and described him as having bright blue eyes, a sprightly step, and fingers that wield his pen and artist brush as quick and sure as when he began his career 75 years ago. The reporter saw his passenger pigeon diorama with 2 carved and painted pigeons and a flock painted in the background. Sawyer hoped to write and illustrate a book about the pigeons titled They Darkened the Sky, but the book was never completed. Sawyer painted a number of larger oil paintings, say 2 feet high and 3 feet wide during this time, and sold them for approximately $800 each. Here is a portrait of him in 1960 at age 80. On Vashon Island, he continued to write articles for nature magazines. He compiled bird and mammal lists of the island, wrote various articles for the Vashon newspaper, and he stated that he worked in oil, watercolor, or pen and pencil, though some of his finest work was done in watercolors. In 1966 and 1969, he made trips back east to see his children. He visited his son Lawrence in Tennessee and his daughter Hope in southern New Jersey at her unexpected wildlife refuge. He stayed in New Jersey a few extra days to attend the graduation of his grandson Needham from high school, where Needham gave the valedictory address. In 1966, he wrote, "I'm 86 and I'm just starting." He described that he would walk 6 miles often from Burton to the town of Vashon and hiked in fields to sketch. He suggested that others should keep walking to live a long life and described himself as a man who never retired except at night. In 1970, he was part of an exhibit of artists in the parks in the Seattle area. He was interviewed at the time about and commented about Yellowstone. Sawyer believed Yellowstone was despoiled even in the 1920s. All those luxury hotels, all those people, some of them doing stupid things, he recalled. When discussing the time he and his wife passed Yellowstone Park around 1960, he commented, "We didn't even stop. There's just too much civilization there now." In conclusion, Sawyer was a multi-talented artist, writer, could publish in scientific journals, magazines, a poet and naturalist. He improved Yellowstone Nature Notes in the 1920s and wrote his own series, Pacific Northwest Nature Notes. He was a prolific artist, making 9,000 sketches and writing 700 articles. He was one of a few naturally recognized bird artists of the 20th century and was part of a 1950s art tour that included works by Audubon. Later in life, he was described as the Dean of American Bird Artists. I don't know who gave him that title, but I've seen that several places, and he was also quite pleased that he had been given that title. And you can find 4 of my YouTube slideshows of Sawyer's art. Just search on Edmund J. Sawyer or Sawyer Nisbet, and they're pretty easy to find. I wanted to thank some organizations and people that helped me with my research. The Yellowstone Heritage and Research Center, the Montana History Portal. Edmund's granddaughter, Mary Ellen Little, is in the picture on the left, and great-grandson Tom Sawyer is next to her on the right. Susan Isaacson, Horace Albright's granddaughter, the Vashon Heritage Museum, and the Unexpected Wildlife Refuge.